Recently, we explored the Rhodesian Bush War, one of the longest conflicts in 20th century Africa. Today, we shift our focus to another major Cold War-era conflict in southern Africa, the South African Border War. This was a struggle between the apartheid regime and Namibian independence fighters closely tied to South Africa's intervention in the Angolan Civil War, which brought them into direct conflict with Cuban forces under Fidel Castro. After World War II, most of Africa remained under colonial rule, while a few independent states existed. South Africa stood out, politically stable, economically strong, and militarily powerful, yet ruled by a white minority. Anti-colonial movements across the continent threatened the established order, and South Africa was determined to suppress them, especially within its sphere of influence. By 1948, racial tensions defined South African politics. The National Party, representing Afrikaner interests, won elections on an apartheid platform, enforcing strict segregation and disenfranchising black South Africans. Dissent was brutally suppressed, culminating in tragic events like the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960, where police killed 69 anti-apartheid demonstrators. The world condemned these actions, and international sanctions began to isolate South Africa. Despite global criticism, South Africa's economy and military continued to grow, supported by abundant natural resources and a strong white population base. They were ready to assert control over neighboring regions, particularly Namibia, then called Southwest Africa, which South Africa had illegally annexed despite its UN mandate status. Resistance emerged with the formation of SWAPO in 1960 and its armed wing, SWALA, in 1962, with backing from the Soviet Union and other socialist allies. Their strategy relied on guerrilla tactics, cross-border raids from Zambia, attacks on white-owned farms, and sabotage. South Africa responded with arrests, policing, and later full-scale military operations, establishing heavily patrolled border zones known as the Cut Line. By the mid-1970s, SWAPO relocated its bases to Angola, closer to Namibia. This coincided with the Angolan independence movement, which fragmented into three main factions: MPLA, UNITA, and FNLA. The MPLA, backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union, allowed SWAPO to operate from Angolan territory. South Africa saw UNITA as a natural ally and began supporting them militarily, eventually deploying troops in southern Angola in operations such as Operation Savannah in 1975. The Cuban intervention dramatically shifted the balance. At Quifangondo, Cuban artillery and advisors helped MPLA forces repel South African-backed FNLA and UNITA attacks, preventing a rapid conquest of Luanda. As Cuban troops continued to arrive, South Africa faced the reality of fighting a well-equipped, determined adversary far from its borders. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, South Africa launched multiple operations to disrupt SWAPO and MPLA infrastructure. Operation Reindeer targeted the Kasinga base, while Protea and Daisy struck deep into southern Angola. These operations inflicted temporary damage, but failed to prevent the growing insurgency. At the same time, PLAN, People's Liberation Army of Namibia, became better trained and armed through Soviet and Cuban support, expanding their raids into Namibia. Under the total strategy policy, the South African government heavily militarized society, increasing defense budgets, extending conscription, and creating paramilitary units like Convoy. These forces specialized in counterinsurgency, often committing human rights violations, yet temporarily slowing plans' advances. Despite tactical victories, South Africa faced international isolation, mounting casualties, and an increasingly capable insurgency. Diplomatic solutions were pursued, leveraging Cold War politics. The U.S., seeking to curb communist influence in southern Africa, mediated talks linking Namibian independence to the withdrawal of Cuban forces from Angola. By the mid-1980s, battles such as Cuito-Cuanavale demonstrated the limits of South African conventional power. Cuban forces, with MPLA support, maintained a strong defensive line. Despite repeated offensives, South Africa could not deliver a decisive blow. In parallel, the plan continued guerrilla operations into Namibia, keeping pressure on the border and stretching South African resources. In 1988, under global pressure and with a shifting Cold War environment, including Gorbachev's Soviet Union seeking détente, negotiations led to the Brazzaville Protocol. South Africa agreed to Namibian independence in exchange for the phased withdrawal of Cuban troops from Angola. Namibia held its first democratic elections in November 1989, and independence was formally declared on March 21, 1990. The last Cuban soldiers left Angola in 1991. The South African border war lasted over 23 years, highlighting the intersection